Thank you for coming today. It's a pleasure to host this session on constructing ethical research surveys and questionnaires. My name is John Russell. I'm the chair of the Langara Research Ethics Board and a member of the Department of Philosophy. The talk today is part of a series of lectures that Langara is putting on video and going to make available on research ethics. The first one we had was last fall, given by Professor Ted Pallas from Simon Fraser University. It had to do with research confidentiality, focused in particular on researcher and institutional obligations. Today is going to focus on ethical issues around constructing research questionnaires and surveys. We have a panel of experts today to inform us. Their names are listed there. I'll introduce them individually as they come up to speak. Each will speak for about 15 or 20 minutes, and then we'll have a question period after that. So get ready. And the first presenter is Terry Howard. Let me introduce Terry.
Geez, that doesn't turn off my devices. Prompt for you.
Right. Turn off your devices. So Terry is a community member for the Langara Research Ethics Board. When he's not busily attending our meetings, he is the director of HIV community-based research for BC at Positive Living BC. Terry has worked with people living with HIV/AIDS for the past 13 years. Providing support, advocacy, and community-based research capacity building. Terry facilitates meaningful engagement of people living with HIV/AIDS in all aspects of the research process and brokers relationships and resources between academic and community partners to develop research projects. So, welcome, Terry. And at this moment, you're already wired up?
I'm wired up.
Okay, so let's
How's the glare off my hair?
Okay, carry on.
There we go. So, welcome everybody. Glad to see there's as many people that turned out here as there are. A little bit more about me. As John said, I'm the director of HIV research at Positive Living BC, which was formerly known as the BC Persons with AIDS Society. It's an AIDS service organization that provides support services for people with HIV all over BC. I work a lot doing research projects both regionally, locally in Vancouver, and then also nationally as well. And I'm also on the ethics board here, which is the connection obviously since 2012. And I'm also nationally on the board of directors for the Canadian Association of HIV Research, or CAR as it's known, and now the secretary of the board. But most importantly, I am an alumnus of Langara from the class of 1975 in art and merchandising from downstairs. So very proud to be an alumnus here. So there is a connection. And my fine arts degree, you'll see, came in handy with my slide preparation and stuff as well. I didn't abandon it totally. So let's begin. As you can see by this slide, I found that the majority of problems with ethical issues in community-based research, or research in general really, from my perspective as a community person, have been around communication. And a lot of the communication issues themselves stem from the interpretation. So when developing research surveys and interview guides, the problem is the same. What you may write down and what you may think is a thought or a way of phrasing something could mean something completely different to you than it does to a community person. So my first point is to really be aware of that. The matter of interpretation is a huge issue to really consider from both sides of that research project perspective. So as you can see, the staff that created this little sign in a fabric shop somewhere, I pulled this off the internet, clearly didn't mean the same thing that we interpret this to mean as outsiders or from our perspective. So it clearly can be a problem with people and something to consider when you're creating any kind of written material for community members. So with HIV research and community-based research in general, there is a principle that we have in place that comes from a sense or a history of protecting the community itself. And this is known as the GPA principle for HIV research, which stands for, as you can see, the greater involvement of people living with HIV/AIDS, or as I like to phrase it, the meaningful engagement of people living with HIV and AIDS, because I don't like to see people just involved in research. I like to see the community members actually engaged. So for your purposes in developing any kind of data collection materials, I would really encourage you to understand and get to know whatever community that your target participants are going to come from. I think it's really important to understand and involve them, if at all possible, in the development of your data collection tools, because clearly they may have a different perspective on what you mean when you specifically ask a question a certain way. And ambiguity is a huge issue with a lot of community people that could mean one thing to one person, another to another. So the interpretation of the data collection tools themselves, the questions that are asked either in an interview or a survey, are critical to getting really quality information. And as we like to say in community research, the rich data comes from really making sure that your question that you're asking is crystal clear in what you're trying to get at. So we have this protection in place. A lot of other communities that do research or people that work with different marginalized communities will also have heard it referred to as nothing about us without us. People that work with drug users, that's a common phrase to be used, but essentially the principle is the same, that really it behooves the research team itself to involve that community group as much as possible, right from the development of a data collection tool and throughout if you can. I actually hire a lot of peer research associates and train peer research associates so they can collect data on the community themselves. That's a different talk for another day, but it actually is something that benefits greatly the research project. So for today, we're talking about ethical issues. So always with research projects, I think that you probably train in your classes about reviewing the Tri-Council or the TCP2 agreements, just to make sure that people are understanding what exactly is meant and what is required for ethics review, and to get approval when you ultimately want to collect data from any given group that you want to do. So I would encourage people to definitely do, there's an online tutorial, it's very easy to do, it's a bit lengthy, but definitely is a huge help. And those are the basic principles. I don't think I need to go into them in any elaboration, but really it's about protecting people from harm, essentially. So if you look at, in your data collection development phase, if you look at that as a premise that you have at the front of your mind every time that you're thinking of a new question or developing the data collection tool, then I think you can't go wrong. If you ask yourself every single time, will this question do any harm? And obviously, most questions are not, but in the ones that are questionable, if you say, is there any potential for harm here? Then you could probably, forego a lot of issues that come up in reviews, like ethical reviews at research or other institutions, universities, etc. So one of the groups that I worked with in my very first job, research project as a principal investigator, was a group of 10 former prisoners, all living with HIV and all active drug users. And that was quite an interesting process in itself, because it was the first time out of the chute for me. I didn't really know what I was doing, but I went in thinking, okay, I've got all these ideas about the information I want to collect, and these guys are the best people to collect that information with, so I'll pick their brains and then I'll go away and develop this wonderful tool that will work. I was at the time working in the prison system and working with prisoners living with HIV, so my idea was to look at some of the factors that cause people to go in and out of prison on such a frequent basis. I would work often with people that would be out of prison for 2 weeks, and I'd hear from them and they'd be back in prison again for a variety of reasons. I wanted to know what those variety of reasons were. So I decided I would get this group of people together and I would train them. So we underwent quite a process. It was a huge learning curve for both sets of the research team here, so the participants themselves and for me. One of the things that we did during the course of data collection was to look at and did some community mapping around where people would go when they got out of prison. So I asked the participants on community maps that were drawn on mostly downtown east side area maps on the floor to go around with markers and say, where's the first place you went when you got out of prison? Where's the second place? Where's the third place? Other questions I threw in, like where would you consider to be a safe zone? Where would you consider to be a danger zone? So with the data collection part, I found that almost every single person in the group all circled Army and Navy as the first stop for getting out of prison. And I thought, well, that's kind of strange. So, of course, being inquisitive, I said, so why did everybody stop at Army and Navy? And they said, oh, well, you get out of prison, you haven't got any money, nowhere to go, no food to eat, so you go to Army and Navy and you steal stuff. And then you go and sell it. So the ethical dilemma for me as a researcher, in this case, was, do I report this information so that the organization, Army and Navy, could protect themselves against this, faced with the fact that if I do that, I'm going to be cutting off the livelihood for a lot of very desperate people when they're getting out of prison, trying not to just continually go in through that revolving door in and out of prison because they aren't provided with adequate means when they get out of prison, so they have to do the only thing they know how to do. So it was a real dilemma, and the other people involved in the research project, we sat down and we tossed it around back and forth quite a lot in terms of what do we report here? Do we have an ethical obligation to report the findings that we had? So this is the larger issue, and it's one that is reflected in a lot of research projects about the information that you gather. In this same project, one of the things I asked people was how they were negotiating some of the systems that were available to them, meaning welfare systems, disability systems, anything governmental issued. And it also came out that one of the issues that some of the guys in the group used were that they would sell their blood to other people that were not positive so that they could actually go get tested, show up with blood, and they would be tested as HIV positive so that they could get onto governmental disability or governmental welfare for an HIV or a disability person, which is a higher level of money, basically. So more money for people. So they would sell their blood, or they would sell the card that they would use to go, their care card to go in and actually get tested to circumvent the system. Again, ethical dilemma. Do I report this? Is this a public health issue? How often is it happening? Is this going to cut off the livelihood for some of these people that, again, use this as a means of supporting themselves or supplementing their income? And again, it was an issue that we took back to the team and we discussed as to what we would report back. So overall, I think that it reflects that you really have a lot of considerations that you can't possibly know going into a research project when you start to collect data about what do you do with the information when you actually get it, and what is the ethical, your framework to use about then reporting that information back as well. So it's not just data collection and the development of those tools, it's also what happens with the information that you are collecting from that very vulnerable population, if that's who you happen to be working with. In my case, it's always been with vulnerable populations. So it's a bit of a dance, and one that I would encourage people to really pay attention to. So just some of the things that I would encourage people, again, if I can make suggestions to this group, that one of the things I would say is don't burn your bridges. So if I had reported back to Army and Navy, and if I had reported back to public health that those practices were going on, I would have burned a bridge in the community of prisoners getting out of prison, prisoners living with HIV, and the drug-using community in general about, I would be the bad guy for reporting that information that they thought was safe in telling me in the context of this information gathering session, right? So be careful about that sort of issue potentially happening in your research project as well. Getting to know your target audience, again, during your data collection development phase, I would encourage you to really bring in some community members, bring in your target audience. If you're going to be working with seniors and you're going to want to survey seniors, bring in a few seniors and let the questions bounce off of them and ask them what their feelings are about how that question is asked, or would that be offensive, or is this the proper language to use to get what we want to get at? Those sorts of things are really invaluable if you do it at the beginning. And then also consider the ramifications from the findings. One of the huge problems that we've had in community research was around Aboriginal research. And I mean, there's reconciliation projects going on all around the country now around some of the ramifications of sensationalizing research that was done in Aboriginal communities across the country about how they were all drug users and how they were all, infecting people with HIV and hepatitis C, and there was this reason and that reason, and it was all so negative and sensationalized that that's what the press grabbed onto, despite the fact that there were some really positive things around prevention activities and cultural identities, etc. As a result of those projects. They were completely overshadowed. So be aware of that. It's not enough to just collect that information. You are also responsible for what gets out there and how it's portrayed when it gets out there. And I'm not naive. I know you can't control all of that, but do the best you can really and be sensitive to it, because you will burn your bridge for sure. You won't be allowed back in that community to do research in the future. And last is about community relevance. So really looking at what your information is that you're gathering. Is that going to be relevant to the community that you're gathering the information with? If it isn't, then your buy-in is going to be low. If it is, and you've given some thought and put some constructive ideas around making the information relevant to them, then your buy-in and your participation rates will go up exponentially. It's amazing how such a simple thing like this can make all the difference in your response rate. And it really makes a huge difference to the community if they hear about it after the fact as well. I would encourage everybody to commit to sharing those results with the community. There's nothing worse than coming into a community doing research and then never letting them know how their participation changed things for them in the future. Hearing about it on the 6 o'clock news or reading about it in a scientific journal just doesn't cut it for community members. It really is. They need to hear it back from the research team itself about the investigation. All right, and lastly, just so you know, there wasn't a total loss of my art degree here. There's a painting I did of my dog Sky and my contact information. So thank you very much.
I will introduce Jean Ruiz. She's worked in the area of research ethics for the past decade. Her current position is Senior Research Ethics Analyst for the Office of Research Ethics at UBC. She focuses primarily on ethical issues in social science and behavioral research. Jean develops for policy for the Behavioral Research Ethics Board at UBC and acts as an educator and resource for both educators and for both researchers and board members. Delivering a variety of workshops and talks on research ethics, as well as conducting one-on-one consultations. And you'll see some of the evidence, quite a bit of the evidence of that in her presentation. Prior to her analyst role, Jean worked for the UBC Clinical Research Ethics Board. This is where I got to know her. And the University of Saskatchewan in both research and management. So, welcome, Jean.
Thanks. Okay, so I'm here today really to talk to you about the Research Ethics Board perspective and hopefully to give you some tips and insights on what goes on behind the scenes at a Research Ethics Board when we're reviewing surveys. So I'm going to start off with an email which feels like I get almost every single day, at least during the school year. And I get an email like this either from students or faculty. And it says, I am just writing to confirm, or dear Ms. Ruiz, I am just writing to confirm that my research survey does not require review. I will be sending out an online anonymous survey to all students in first year medicine to 10 universities across Canada. I will not be collecting names, IP addresses, or any other information that would identify any other individual. I will, however, collect the name of the institution they attend. Many thanks for your advice. Sincerely, keen student. Like I said, I get this email, okay, maybe it's not daily, it feels like daily. I got one just last week and it was one of my favorites. It said, Jean, there was no Miss Ruiz. All I'm doing is collecting numbers, just numbers. No names, nothing else. So here, I feel like this is sort of how researchers approach survey research. They look at survey research as being very minimal risk, and they figure that the Research Ethics Board basically looks at risk as being a factor of whether or not something requires a review or doesn't require a review. Certainly risk does play into to how we approach the review, but it actually doesn't have anything to do about whether or not we do need to review a survey or not. So I know lots of you have seen this. Oh, this works much better. So this is from the Tri-Council policy statement, which Terry referenced. So this is the overarching Canadian guidelines for research involving human participants. And so as a reminder, I thought I would just start with what requires review. So research is an undertaking intended to extend knowledge through disciplined inquiry or systematic investigation. In case you're not sure what a disciplined inquiry is, disciplined inquiry refers to anything that is conducted within a discipline with the expectation that the methods, results, and conclusions will be able to withstand the scrutiny of the relevant research community. So if you're doing that, and you're using human participants, so those individuals whose data or responses to interventions, stimuli, or questions by the researcher are relevant to answering the research question, you are doing research as defined by the Tri-Council policy statement, and you do require review. A survey is almost impossible to do without a human participant. And so if you're doing a survey or a questionnaire, and you're doing it for research purposes, which most people are when they contact me, you do require review. And the fact that your survey may be not collecting any information, just numbers, or it may be very minimal risk, actually doesn't factor into whether or not it does require review or not. So why is review important? So there is this assumption that survey research is very minimal risk. And that actually may be true in a lot of cases, so I'm not here to deny that. But there are real risks involved in surveys. Surveys around sensitive topics can result in quite a bit of upset or distress. There is a real potential for loss of confidentiality, which I'll leave for Dina to talk about. We receive surveys all the time and complaints about surveys all the time. So I think sometimes we don't get feedback from our researchers enough. And there's lots of evidence that suggests that, in fact, people do get upset by the surveys that they take. One good example of this was that a researcher had put an application through our board, and the application was to do a research survey with the participants. So in fact, it was meant to be done in person. It wasn't an online survey, it wasn't a questionnaire that was mailed out. The participant came in one day and they had really overbooked themselves. It just happened to be a busy day, somebody was sick, and the researcher gave the questionnaire to the individual saying, you know what, just give me 15 minutes. Here's the questionnaire, take a look at it, see what you think. So the participant did, and ended up actually taking it home and doing it there on their own. The participant became very upset by the questions that were asked in the survey. They weren't expecting, although they had been consented to participate, they weren't expecting the directed type of questions that they were being asked. And they really missed that contextualization that the researcher was supposed to be giving them. And that resulted in a phone call to our office. And of course, the researcher did work with the participant to make them, generally, like I said, it's a contextualization to put your experience within a broader perspective. But it does happen. And so it is something to keep in mind. However, saying that, and you should be sensitive to the potential issues that your survey research has, I would say that most survey research is in fact minimal risk, specifically in the social sciences and behavioral area. So the Research Ethics Board isn't going to just destroy your survey. Some people get really nervous about it and they're not sure. We will base our review based on the risk level in your survey, which is proportionate. So this is the higher the risk, the higher the scrutiny, the lower the risk, the lower the scrutiny. That said, be realistic, and this is where I'm not sure, and maybe the Research Ethics Board members can tell us. We often get researchers who see that there's a box on the application, and it's called risks, and they think they need to put something in there. And so they get excited, and they start to really, articulate these very improbable risks in the area of maybe it's a survey on recreational park use. Excuse me, I'm just... So they, there may have been something that happened in the park or not in the park, and they just don't want to say that there's really no foreseen risks in this research. So we did get that quite a bit at research at UBC, and I always thought I would give kudos to the researchers for being creative. But you don't need to do that. You don't need to do that. Be realistic. Only talk about foreseeable risks. There is literature, or there are areas where you may be dealing or delving a little bit into sensitive areas. So you're walking that line between research that might be kind of sensitive for some people, but may not be. So this might be, let's say you're doing work around abuse, but you're asking a general population. You're not really targeting people who have been abused. You're looking at perceptions in the general population. You're looking at a healthy adult population. There is lots of literature that suggests that people engaging in so-called sensitive surveys are, in fact, there's benefit to them for doing that, and that there may not be as much of a risk, this sort of psychological risk or re-trauma that we often get worried about in the Research Ethics Board as we have historically thought there may be. There is quite a bit of literature. And so what I tell researchers that if you're working in those areas and you want to make sure that we are proportionately approaching your review, so not sending it to full board when it doesn't need to be, quote literature in the area that discusses how a research participant experiences your type of research, and also your own experience. There's a difference between a student who's engaging in a research project that maybe a little bit of conservatism would be good around how to approach risks, and a very, very seasoned researcher who's been doing this for 30 years, who has lots of evidence that suggests that people engaging in these more sensitive topics is actually healthy for them, and that actually doesn't produce the types of risks that we are sometimes very concerned about in a Research Ethics Board scenario. So I'm going to zip through a couple slides here just to talk about some of the things that the board will look for. There's tons of different types of recruitment, but the two most that do sort of have risks inherent to them is direct approach recruitment and third-party recruitment. So direct approach is this idea that you're going to walk up to a participant, you're the researcher, you want them to consent and potentially take the survey right on the spot. Survey research may be the only area that we really approve this type of approach. There can be exceptions, but generally for the park use, the recreational park use, or let's say the monument was put up and people are walking by and someone's approaching you. What do you think about the monument? Do you think it obstructs the view? Do you think, one more question, and they're answering in an anonymous way. That would be a direct approach. What we want to see you think about in your research ethics application is undue influence and voluntariness. Lots of people have just a personality where that if someone asks them to do something, they feel obliged to do it. And that is why researchers want to use direct approach, because the response rate is higher, right? So depending on the risk level in the research, we'll think about that, but we want to see you discuss how you're going to deal with that. We would also want to see a script of what you're going to say to people when you come, when you approach them directly. This is a good thing. This is why going through the board is a good thing. It helps specifically students. Sometimes people get there and they're like, okay, I'm going to approach someone for a survey. What am I going to say? They haven't actually thought through that yet. So think through it, make sure you include a script to the rep, explain why undue influence isn't going to be a big factor in your research. The other one is third-party recruitment. It is a more preferred method. This is a person who has arm's length to the research is going to be doing the recruitment. Here we want to see that there's no release of contact information to the researcher without the participant's consent. Often in surveys, this looks something like it's an online survey and an email is sent out to people, and that email maybe is sent out to more people, so this is sort of like snowballing. And then people would just either contact the researcher themselves or take the survey anonymously, and the researcher never knows who participated. But here we would want to again see what the medium is. Is it email? Is it paper? And you'd need to include all of your recruitment materials in your research ethics application. Of course, there's others. I'm actually not going to talk about them because I'm going to run out of time. But the others are less sticky. So consent. For most survey research, consent can be implied just by the completion of the research, of the survey, a cover letter is usually included, and it should include enough information for the participant to make an informed decision about participating. This includes the study title, the contact information for the principal investigator, a short description of the study including risks, benefits, and limits to confidentiality, a statement that participation is voluntary, a local REB complaint line, and a statement as follows: by completing the questionnaire, you are consenting to participate in the research. It doesn't need to be exactly that statement, but it does need to be clear to the participant that this is what they're doing. And I will put a warning out there that depending on the nature of the research, it still may be a good idea to have a signed consent form or sit down with your participant, whether you need a signature or not. You don't always need a signature, but it still might be a good idea to have that human contact. That helps you with the inclusion criteria. It helps them feel comfortable with you and your research. It gives them an opportunity to talk to you. So it really depends on what your research is about. So I'm going to move here and just talk a little bit about a complaint that our office received, which I think is a really interesting one because it shows a number of things that I think people just overlook despite their best intention when it comes to survey research. This was a participant, the participant population in this research was a population with disabilities. And one of the participants contacted our office and offered a number of commentaries around the survey. First, she noted that the survey was difficult to access, and it didn't include an offer to help people who may have difficulty answering the survey. She actually recommended a two-step process, first asking people maybe via email whether they would be interested, and then asking them what kind of resources they might need in order to fill out the survey, and whether there could be an assistance in that way. For example, Skype or telephone might have been a more appropriate way to collect the survey information in this case. Second, she claimed that, was that a warning? No. Oh, okay. Second, she claimed that there was no neutral question to skip, no neutral question or the ability to skip. And this is, again, within an online survey platform, and the participants weren't allowed to skip a question that they may not have felt comfortable answering. This was one of my favorite parts of the complaint when she highlighted how I don't understand how this got through an REB. Third, she complained about the use of language in the survey. She thought that the language was quite colloquial. Well, colloquial is not necessarily the right word, but what we need to remember, especially in an online situation, that your survey may go internationally. And so what is understood locally, it may not be understood even just in the US or in other countries. And this was just some subtle stuff around language in the survey that she wasn't quite sure what they mean, what the researcher meant. And lastly, she complained that she wasn't offered the results of the research. So going back up to the first one, accessibility, the online environment gives us lots of flexibility, and it's been really great in lots of ways. But what you need to think about when you're designing a survey is, will people understand how to use the software? Is it reliable? Another really good example was there's a big institution in BC that was doing a survey within their institution, and obviously there was some sort of interest or perhaps politics internally around this survey, because when it launched, it promptly crashed, and we got a flood of phone calls of people who were really desperate to meet the deadline for this survey because they wanted their information included. And so you need to make sure that what you propose to do in a technology platform is actually going to work. Do a pilot, check it out. Does it work? Is the font readable? Depending on your population, it may be hard for them to read. Are the questions in plain language? For some people, doing this sort of online environment is really easy to navigate. For others, it's not. The second one was about voluntariness. This thing about including a statement that questions can be skipped, but also working that into your system, making it easy for people to skip a question. What was interesting about the previous complaint was that the researcher who was a very seasoned researcher and was very open to dealing with all of these, actually did a pilot of that, and one of that particular survey with a different group of people with a variety of different disabilities. And one of the reasons he took that function off was because people who were using screen readers and other different resources to access the survey were accidentally skipping questions. And that's what they told him. They said, I didn't mean to skip the question. And so he thought he was doing people a favor by taking that functionality out of the survey platform and making each question mandatory. And so it's sort of solving one problem and taking away the other. So I thought that was interesting. So here's where you would want to think about something like having a neutral question. I prefer not to answer. Inclusiveness, think about the categories you are using. Are you excluding people by the nature, the demographic language you are using? This is really important when it comes to inclusiveness. Things like gender, sex, race are they can be sensitive categories, and it's not as black and white as it potentially, it used to be. You can't just say female or male. You can't just say Caucasian. Is this a category that you actually need? That's another one. Can you leave an open text box so people can self-identify? Think through that. Is this important for your data to have people put into one of 4 categories? Is that really necessary? The results. Ensure to share your results. That's why you're doing this. This goes across the board. In fact, all of these lessons can be, it's not just survey research, but your results, and as Terry highlighted, it's so important to be engaging with the communities that you're working in. It's so important for you personally, not the internet and other things, to be disseminating your research results. That's the one thing you can give back to your participants, because in most social sciences and behavioral research, they're not getting much benefit besides that. Besides that, I was part of this small research or big research project, whatever it is. Okay, so I'm going to, I don't know if theoretical considerations is the best way to think about this, but I thought I would end with just some thoughts on survey research in general, specifically online surveys. They become very popular. It's a way to collect mass amounts of information. It's easy, it's cheap, you can get a huge subject pool, but that can be detrimental to your research as well. So it's important to keep in mind that the way you choose to recruit people can affect your research results. For example, crowdsourcing tools like Mechanical Turk. Are people familiar with Mechanical Turk? So yes? Yeah? No? So this is do you guys deal with these? No? Oh, okay. So this is it's an Amazon, do you do it at SFU? Yeah. So it's a crowdsourcing tool, which basically you're paying people to give you research results. And so researchers put their surveys up, and they pay people anywhere from 10 cents to $1 to take their surveys. You can get hundreds of results in 3 or 4 days. So it becomes really great. I mean, now, what used to take months, we can just get out in 5 days. But there's pros and cons. to this. Lots of people using Mechanical Turk. There's some really interesting articles. Just Google Mechanical Turk and crowdsourcing. For example, it was supposed to be kind of a hobby. People get to choose what research they're interested in. They self-select for inclusion criteria, and then they go to do the survey. But there's lots of discussion around that. In fact, a lot of people are using Mechanical Turk as their livelihood. Yes, they're living off of it. They get $400 or $500 a month. They do 100 surveys a day. They get very good at some of the questions, if this, then that, if that, and this. They've seen it 20 times, and they even know the questions that are put in there to make sure that you're not just answering B. There's a whole culture around this. People take pride in being true in every single survey. At least the stuff I've read is that the actual, they call them Turkers, are really do answer truthfully the survey. But there's literature that suggests that a lot of these people are poor and they represent a certain demographic. So how does that cloud your research results? Is that something you need to consider? Could be. The psychology subject pools. There's research that suggests that a lot of what a psychology survey research is based on first and second year psychology students taking a 110 course and getting credit for it. Then the research is generalized to a regular adult population. I would argue that maybe that's not representative of just adults at large. People attending Western universities in undergraduate. Now, some people might say, I just say it's something to think about. It's something to think about when you're using these tools and bringing that into your methodology. The last one was just the absent researcher. Of course, that's great in these when you're working with illegal activities. And you need to protect the confidentiality. There was a survey that came through us that was directed on child abuse. The questions that were asked in that survey were truly upsetting. Things like, what would you do if, or have you ever burnt your child with a cigarette butt? People are not going to answer that question if they are not anonymous, because it's a reportable. That's one of the few things you do need to report to authorities under law is child abuse. And so, of course, that's an area in which confidentiality would be extremely important. But it does decrease certainty about consent. Do people really understand what they're going through, what they're consenting, what the research is about? And it decreases your ability to make sure that people are fitting your inclusion criteria. And last one, what if the participant does become upset? It is an anonymous survey, you can't get back to them. I've seen, and sometimes this just has to be the reality. But if you're doing depression scales or these sorts of things and you promise anonymity, you start to get results that suggest a wide area of people are severely depressed. Is that something that you are obligated to act on or not? So there are issues to think through. I'm not discouraging you from doing survey research. I just wanted to leave that as some thoughts in the air. Anyways, that's all I have to say. I hope I didn't go over. This is the UBC guidelines for survey research. Feel free to use them. I might want to vet them past John, make sure that they're in line with Langara's. And if you have any questions, feel free to contact me. Probably want to contact your local REB first, but we work together, so you're welcome.
Our next presenter is Dina Shafey. She's been the Associate Director, Office of Research Ethics at Simon Fraser University since October 2012. She previously held roles at Fraser Health Authority as a Research Ethics Coordinator and BC Children's Hospital as a grant facilitator. In her current role at SFU, Dina ensures that the concepts and requirements of ethical conduct and research are communicated to faculty members, staff, REB members, and students by conducting educational and training sessions. Dina facilitates the review and ethics approval of any human participant research that is conducted under the auspices of Simon Fraser University. Thanks.
So my job today is to talk about confidentiality and anonymity in surveys. And so I'll just start with those two words. People tend to use them interchangeably, but really they mean two different things in research. So anonymity really means it's anonymous. There was never any direct or indirectly identifying information collected with the information, so with the survey. So there's absolutely no way that a researcher would know who participated in the study. They wouldn't be able to reconnect the person who participated to their data. Whereas confidentiality really means you're safeguarding that information. So you could have collected directly identifying information like name, email address, cell phone number, or indirectly identifying information like postal code, date of birth, any information that could together identify a person. But what you're doing is then you're safeguarding it. So you've either coded the data or anonymized the data, but you're essentially keeping it safe from being disclosed unintentionally. So I'm going to give you some examples of just some really simple surveys where it is anonymous or whether it is confidential. So the first one is, so it's this online survey. The researcher is sending an email with a survey link to all students in a first-year psychology class. So there's 300 students. The survey is about stress and exams, so nothing too risky, nothing that would be that upsetting. And there's no identifying information collected, and there's no really indirect identifying information collected. So in this case, we would say that this is really anonymous. Like the researcher, there's no way of knowing who in the class participated and whose data. There's no way to relink back the data that they've submitted in their survey to a particular person. Now, if we just change it a little bit, so we'll keep it as the psychology class, 300 students. The survey's still the same, and there's no direct identifying information, so no name, no email address. But now it's a paper survey. And so the students fill out the survey, and once they're done, they just drop it off in a box. So as long as the researcher isn't like watching the box to see who's putting the surveys back in, he or she is not going to know who's participated in the study. And now the researcher is collecting some indirect information. And so that is major, course enrollment, gender, and GPA. So in a class of 300 students, this information together will unlikely identify an individual because the participant pool is so large. So in this case, we may call this anonymous. If there was something else here that could identify particular individuals, we may ask the researchers to stay away from the use of the word anonymous and use the word confidential instead. So now let's change this a little bit more. So still, the student is going to complete the survey. Doesn't matter whether it's online or paper. The survey is still the same, and the same information is being collected. But the participant pool has now changed. So now the researcher is collecting it from 3 different fourth-year psychology classes, and there's only 15 students in each class. So that's a total pool of 45 people. With the course enrollment, you'd be able to tell which person out of the different classes was participating. If you had a person who was enrolled in 2 of the classes, and you knew their gender and their GPA, that it might be easy for that, and if that researcher knows those students, it might be easy for them to identify that individual. Also, if that information happened to be disclosed unintentionally, other people may be able to identify that individual. So really, we wouldn't call this anonymous at all. We would say, we would make sure that a researcher is keeping that information confidential, but that also in the consent form, that researcher is telling those students that it is possible, that it may be possible, that he or she will be able to identify that they've participated in the study, and that they may be able to know which survey they submitted. And in this case, because the study is about stress and exams, that may not be a big issue for a student. They may not care that the researcher knows that they participated or that they can figure out which survey is theirs. But let's change the topic now to cheating in exams, right? And so now we're talking about academic integrity. And depending on the institution and the researcher, if this happens to be a faculty member, there may be policies in place where if a faculty member finds out that a student has been cheating, that they might have to report that. So in this case, we know that that's a possible risk at the beginning. And so as an RUB, you would find out, well, is it really necessary to collect all this information? Is it really necessary to only have 45 participants or from these specific classes? Could you not expand your recruitment, to different areas. So that way, it isn't as easy to figure out who those individuals are. And then also, you would probably, if you did have to report that information, or if you did have to reveal that information, that would have to be disclosed to participants in a consent form before they actually participated in a study. So in this, these are very simple examples, but as you can see, like the difference between what anonymous means and what confidential means. And so why is this important? So when I first started at SFU a few years ago, I came across this complaint from a parent. And so the complaint was about they participated in the survey, or they were requested to participate in a survey. It was a BC school survey. It was sent to many different BC schools and asked parents to complete the survey on health, child behavior, and parental depression. The language in the consent form said that the information was going to be anonymous and that they weren't going to be, the data wasn't going to be used for anything other than the research. But it had no information on who was going to access the data, and it was funded by the Ministry of Education. And we found out that it was actually collecting date of birth, postal code, the school, and ethnic status. And so in this case, the parent was really upset because they are from a small community on Vancouver Island. And so just by the date of birth and the postal code and the school, this information, it would be easy to identify that parent and his child. And so he was worried because of the information on the survey about parental depression, that if someone were to respond, I'm depressed several days in a row, that maybe that information would have to be reported to the Child and Family Services. So it is something to think about. Really, you need to be more forthcoming when you're talking to participants about the data you're collecting, how it's going to be used. So the REB response in this case was just, we made sure that all the consent forms were revised, the participants were fully aware of what type of information that was being collected, that it was going to be kept confidential, who was going to have access to it, and then we made the researcher write a letter to the parent just to address their concerns. And so these are the kind of the things to think about. Who are your participants? Are they part of a vulnerable population? What kind of information are you collecting? Would it put the participant at risk if that information was disclosed? Just like in that cheating case, well, if a participant had said that they were cheating, that might put them at risk of being expelled from the university. Would you have to report the information? So there are some things like child abuse that obviously everyone has a requirement to report, but there's also professionals who must report certain information. So clinical psychologists and physicians, if someone says that there's substantial risk of harming themselves or harming others, that information has to be reported. So if you're running a survey where you are asking people about suicidal ideation or cutting themselves or anything in which they might be harming themselves, and you have the ability to connect that information to the person, and you have a professional duty to report, that needs to be revealed to the participant before they actually fill out the survey. And then you have to think about, are you collecting directly or indirectly identifying information? Because in that case, you could be asking those things in a survey, but if you weren't collecting any direct or indirect identifying information, then you wouldn't have the ability to report because you wouldn't know who said, yes, yes, I'm cutting myself, or yes, I'm gonna commit suicide, or something like that. And in some cases, we may ask you for a justification for the data you want to collect. If we're worried that it might reveal who that person is, and if there's a combination of information, we might want to know your justification for needing that information. You very well may need that information. We just would need a justification for it. And then how are you collecting this data? Paper or online? Is the data housed in Canada or US? Because that needs to be disclosed, and I'll just talk about that in terms of survey platforms. There's all these different survey platforms you can use. There's Fluid Surveys, SurveyMonkey, Qualtrics. I don't know if Langara has their own. I know SFU has their own web survey. So all of these platforms hold their data somewhere. So some of them hold the data in Canada. Some of them hold them in the US. Some of them hold the data in Canada, but they have employees in the US that can access the data for like troubleshooting purposes. So all that information needs to be known and disclosed to your participants because the laws in the different countries matter, right? Like who can access the data for what reasons. And so we wouldn't stop you necessarily from using it, although we do tend to, at least at SFU, we tend to encourage people to use the platforms where the data is held in Canada. But if you're, say, Qualtrics, which I think now has a Canadian, can hold some data in Canada, but I think before it's been all in the US. But to use Mechanical Turk, you need to use Qualtrics. And so if you wanted to be able to target participants through Mechanical Turk, you have to use Qualtrics. And so you wouldn't have an option to use fluid surveys, and so you just say, we would need to use it for this reason for our recruitment purposes. And then also, does the platform collect IP addresses? Because IP addresses can be identifiable, can indirectly identifiable. And so we usually ask that people don't collect them, because unless you have a reason for needing the IP address, because usually the platforms have a choice, like you can check off don't collect IP address. And so we ask that people do that. And really, it's all about disclosure to the participant. In both the slide before, in terms of what we would want, the information you kind of need to know before you kind of create your survey, it's whatever you decide to do, you just need to be really forthcoming with the participant. Like, I'm going to collect this data. It's going to be used for this purpose. These are the people who are going to be able to access it. Because I'm collecting the data in a coded manner, I can relink back to you submitting it. But we don't think that that's going to be risky to you because of X, Y, Z factor. So it's really just about telling people so that they can make an informed decision about participating in your study. And then the last thing is just really analyzing and disseminating your results to try to keep it confidential for the participant. Your data should be analyzed in block form, and it should be disseminated as aggregate results. And then be careful when disseminating results, because it's possible to indirectly identify individuals or groups of individuals. So for example, say you're surveying senior judges in different provinces, and you've decided to disseminate the results based on jurisdiction and gender. If you only have 2 judges who responded from BC, or if and one of them happens to be female, like you may indirectly identify people that way, right? So you have to think about how big is your participant pool, and what information are you releasing as you're speaking about that participant pool, because that can indirectly identify people even though you didn't mean to. And that's it.
So question period now. Before we get there, is Alex Golden here? No. So Alex sent me some information about fluid survey at Langara, which is a platform that we have access to. I'd be interested in comments from Dean about fluid survey, having specific things to say. And you can contact or discuss with Alex Yusuf for setting up and use of fluid survey through Langara. Fluid survey meets all FIPA requirements, so legally it passes muster in British Columbia. I presume that means the data is kept in Canada?
Yeah. The data is kept in Canada, but the employees are US, and they can access it, but only if they're given permission by the researcher.
Okay, good. All right, so question period now. I will keep a speakers list, questionnaires list. Maybe what you could do is you could pass the mic when you're asked questions, and because the people who ask questions will not be mic'd, would you mind summarizing what you understand to be the question? That might be a tough. Okay, so we'll start with Ted, and then Jeff, and then Rita.
Thanks. The question for me, I guess, is I've been reading more and more over the last little bit about privacy and surveillance kinds of issues. And years ago, I know with SFU, one of the things with the USA Patriot Act, that starting from then it was okay, don't use U.S. servers, but following all of the Snowden revelations and all, I guess and maybe I know too much, but now I start to think that there is no, if you're talking, and I found it interesting, Dina, when you were talking about online surveys, that there were ones that you considered anonymous, which to me intuitively seems reasonable. But at the same time, given what we now know about the kind of information that's collected and so forth, I'm starting to think that nothing is anonymous if you're doing it online, and that you have to start off with that assumption. And consequently, for me, I start to think of it in terms of, well, how sensitive is the information? And if it's sensitive, I would never do online. But if it's not, then it seems, anyway. I'm just wondering, can you tell me a little bit more about? Have I gone too far in the other direction, that nothing is could be considered anonymous, or?
Sorry, repeating the question is nothing considered anonymous? And so I guess for us, in online surveys. So I guess for us, I try not to think to the extreme so much as nothing is anonymous. But I guess you could be right if. But I guess for us, when I think about it, I'm like, if you're not collecting IP address, you don't have any names, and you don't have any really indirectly identifying information, and your study is really about. So we just had one the other day that was about cereal boxes, and whether stories on the back of a cereal box is going to make you more likely to buy a cereal box. And so in that case, all the questions had to do with the cereal box. It had nothing to do with that person's, any kind of demographic information from that person. So really, I don't know how that could not be considered anonymous. So to me, I just don't have the extreme of everything is not. Like I don't think that way. And most of our board members don't think that way. So.
And just to clarify your question, are you thinking that are you suggesting then from a technological perspective, even when IP address is turned off, that there's still a way to track back to the computer? Is that a concern of yours, or?
That would be the concern, yeah, that if every, through trackers and through, and because of the interests of national security agencies in all sorts of different countries, that in theory at least, every click, every response, every email is collected somewhere. To me then of course, then you have the pragmatics of, would anybody ever be interested in this? Which to me is a different way of looking at it than, in theory, is it anonymous or is it not?
Yeah. Just the way our board would approach something like that, similar to Dina, and just as Dina mentioned in her talk, and I think we would go to the consent process at that point as well. There's so much information out there, and a lot of it is sensitive, that in some ways anonymity comes in the bulk of how much information is there. So I would hesitate to go as far to say that you cannot use an online survey in a sensitive situation. And I would say what you need to be doing is fully disclosing what are the potential consequences in the online environment to your participants, and relying on them and their ability to make a consent in that process, if you can do that. One of the things that I found was interested in the merger. I don't know if you know about SurveyMonkey bought Fluid Surveys. So Fluid Surveys was the Canadian icon. Everybody was using Fluid Surveys, and then SurveyMonkey buys it, and that's a U.S. platform. And there was this big hype around the Patriot Act and everything like that. So, SFU and UBC, we're all in a panic. We don't know what to do. And do we put this disclaimer about the Patriot Act? Is the Patriot Act, is that even a legitimate disclaimer? And the disclaimer was kind of scary, to be honest. A lot of the times it is about cereal boxes, and we have this disclaimer on there about the U.S. government accessing the information. And so we contacted SurveyMonkey, and honestly, they have never once had the Patriot Act be used to take their data from them. It's not happened once. Now, that doesn't mean it won't happen. It doesn't mean it won't happen, and I agree with you that if you were doing research in the area of national security specifically, in an area that the U.S. government or Canadian government might want to have access to it. We had an interesting study come through that involved terrorism last year or the year before, which was a huge process for us because the study actually there was interest on a national security level around the study. So in those studies, you might want to think of alternate ways to collect your information, and but I would say in most even sensitive areas, you probably would be okay with disclosures on your consent form around potential loss of confidentiality and letting people decide.
Thank you. Jeff?
Actually, I've got a comment as opposed to a question. Is that relevant or no?
You can make a comment.
I can make a comment. Just quickly on the selection bias, I'm glad you presented sort of a balanced perspective. I want to sort of push the other end of it a little bit. I mean, I've been reading, there's a fair amount of articles coming out now that these are empirical questions about whether online surveys are give you a different set of findings or values or attitudes from directly assessing people. And the articles I've been reading suggest when they actually directly compare an online survey with bums in the seat sort of questionnaire data, they're very similar. So now I'm sure there's other studies that have the opposite, but I think we need to be aware of the fact that when you actually empirically test these claims, sometimes they don't support sort of our assumptions about that. In terms of just the IP address, Mechanical Turk is one thing because they actually are paid. So that's a very, very different sample set than like Fluid Survey. And the IP address there actually can have a legitimate focus because if you check it, people, because they're getting paid, they will do the survey 10 times, the same survey, not 100 different surveys, the same survey, which of course totally screws up your data set. So having a unique IP address eliminates that problem. So I think I don't know much about this stuff, about these issues at all, but I mean, that's one sort of legitimate thing. And finally, just really quickly, because I'm in the psychology department, I mean, the old saw about psychology pool not representing anything is also, when it's empirically tested, not actually that accurate. I just sent a study to John in which I had a study on memory with bums in the seat Langara students, and then someone in Bangladesh took my scale, translated it into Bangladeshi, used housewives, business people, older adults, and the results were virtually identical. So once again, these are issues that need to be thought about, but I mean, I think
I just put them out there.
yeah, they're overdone, I think, in some cases.
So I just want to talk about the IP address. So we suggest it, but if you had an argument as to why you wanted to keep it, then it'd be fine. But then you couldn't say your survey is anonymous, really,
Right.
because there's a possibility, right?
Yeah.
So.
Absolutely. Thank you for letting me finish.
My question is primarily for Terry, is you mentioned about working with the group that you're working with, and I am involved in working with the Aboriginal population, and we were thinking about using standardized surveys, but I'm thinking those standardized surveys may not assess in that group, so how would you go about modifying them or changing them to be more appropriate for that population?
So the question was about modifying survey questions for cultural appropriateness for an Aboriginal specific audience. So I would again go back to involving the community when you're developing the survey tool or whatever you're going to use for data collection, and just do some pilots. If you can't bring anybody in at the development stage, then do some pilots with a select group of people and ask them specifically, what's the language like, and is any of this offensive, et cetera. All the things that you probably know intellectually that are red flags for you to start with, and you're making an educated guess, so that's a great start. But really checking it against who your target audience is, I think, is a really smart idea, because you will alleviate a lot of issues further down the road when you won't get those kinds of letters that go to Jean and Dina, for sure. So.
Back to online data security. It's one thing to have the portal pretty secure. Do you ever account for which browser the respondent will be using it with, or what sort of data will be collected without their knowledge?
I don't know. We haven't really thought about that. No, we haven't. Have you guys thought about that?
Because I mean, like Chrome will chop your info to death, whereas Firefox tends to be a bit more judicious. Are you able to offer them a direct login to your server? Those are all three areas where...
Well, I know that the SFU web survey, you have a direct login to get in, but the other ones, I don't know I don't know. We've never really talked about it.
I mean, it's one thing for the portal to be secure, it's another thing for the pipeline to be leaking.
So, okay, when you're filling out a survey, though, does Chrome know that you're filling out that survey?
Yeah.
Could it not?
Okay, that's something to look into. I'll have to look into that and get back to you.
If you did a serial study over Chrome, it would be interesting to see how many ads started popping up versus ads.
Yeah.
Changes.
Good question. Ryan?
Questions for Dina. Do you think that researchers have a responsibility to disclose to participants the anticipated sample size? So if you're making efforts to anonymize your research, but your sample size is small enough that you could attribute names to your data, do you think that it's, it is important for participants to know that perhaps the sample size is only 10?
Yes. So the question was, should participants know what the size of the sample, and that is yes. I think you should, especially if it's a specific group of people that you're targeting. I think they should be aware of that.
How do you control that when you are relinquishing some control over the recruitment process?
So I think you might have a number, like you might say, like there may be, like if you know that you need a minimum to actually do your research and get a reasonable answer, then you would put that minimum. At a minimum, it's going to be this number of people, and you'd say maybe, but I'm aiming for X number. And that's how we would do it. Because we normally try to let people know how many people are going to be recruited in the study. And yeah, so especially when it is a small number and the group is really targeted. Just because in the end, the way the data is going to be used and the way the data may be disseminated may indirectly identify someone. So especially when that's the risk involved, and I mean, there might be other studies where, like the serial one, if the person wanted to say that there were only 20 people were going to be recruited, we may not require them to tell people that, because really there's no way that you'd indirectly identify that only 20 people out of these 20 people talking about cereal boxes were, that this information came from X, Mr. X, right? So, so it really just depends on context as well.
Thanks. Kevin?
This is directed at both Jean and Dina. Course-based research, right? I teach statistics here at Langara College, and in our introductory courses, we have a term project that involves, for the most part, observational studies in the form of a survey, right? And I'd be interested in just hearing briefly from both of you whether this is happening at UBC and Simon Fraser, and any kind of advice you can give us about student-based research in the context of a course.
So when you said it was basically observation in the form of a survey, can you just tell me a bit more about that?
We, as instructors teaching these courses, have applied for approval to the Research Ethics Board. That the instructor essentially becomes the first go-to person in terms of evaluating the questionnaire, whether it's appropriate, issues of confidentiality and anonymity. But as I look at your presentations, I worry more than am comforted by what we're doing here at Langara, right? Because many of the issues you talk about here can crop up even in a term project of a student who wants to, for example, measure the prevalence of depression among the Langara student population. Right? And most of our research, or all of it, I would say, most of it, not all, is done right here among the student population.
Okay. I guess I was a bit confused around when you said it was an observational research in the form of a survey.
An observational study I'm referring to as, which would include a survey.
Oh, okay. Okay. So the question is around course-based research and whether the I guess you want us to talk to how UBC and SFU deal with this, because of course this happens at UBC quite a bit. And we have a very similar system as you do, in that we at UBC, what we do is we have the instructor of the course puts in a framework to the Research Ethics Board. That framework is approved by the board and presented to the students, and then the teacher becomes, or the instructor becomes, the ethical mitigator of those, of any sort of ethical issues that might crop up. So yes, you're right. We're basically deferring the responsibility of us, the Research Ethics Board, to the instructor, which is, it can be a bit scary for some people, but there are safeguards put in place, and I'm assuming Langara has similar requirements. For UBC, the research has to be very minimal risk. It's not even just minimal risk. It has to be very minimal risk, and I know that's very subjective, but so the example might be the recreational use of parks. It has to be research that's done for pedagogical purposes, which I'm assuming is similar at Langara. So the students are learning how to do research. So often we don't like and don't want to see students approaching vulnerable populations to practice doing research. We don't think that's appropriate. So we're not any of those sort of, like you use depression as an example. That might be a survey that we would not, a type of survey that we would recommend has to come through the regular streams. I'd have to see the details of it. And so all these risks that I'm listing, these are kind of extreme situations. These are things that you need to be aware of and you need to think about. Doing a talk like this to your class and just warning them about it might be sufficient enough. But the reality is that most of social sciences and behavioral research, survey research, is in fact very minimal risk, and the chances of harm are quite low. And so I would encourage you to sort of calm yourself a little bit that way, taking some safeguard in the proportionate review, which is why we put this system in place, because we do think that the value that the students get from engaging in research, at UBC at least, we felt that it was too much of a hurdle. We deal with over 1,000 applications a year, and then to have on top of that all of the student applications coming through. What was happening is students were not getting that opportunity, and we just thought that was detrimental. It's a research institution. We're teaching students to be researchers. They need to be allowed to engage in those activities. But that's why we have those parameters in place, that very low risk. You are a guide for them. They should know they can come to you, but also so is your Research Ethics Board. So if there is an issue, we're happy to get involved. It's just that we don't need to get involved in that up front. I don't know if I'm helping.
We're the exact same way. We're the exact same way.
Yeah, okay.
Can I follow that up? Yes. I'm in the psychology department. We don't. We do group projects as well, but they're experiments, and so they manipulate a variable. So, for instance, I'll just ask us straight-up questions. I can tell my students next semester. And suppose my students are interested in the relationship between, negative emotions and helping behavior. That's not the best study in the world, but could they show a 3-minute video clip of a very sad event from a movie, for instance? Okay, half the people get the sad event, half the people get a neutral travelogue film, and then we measure how frequently they help people or something like that.
They help people?
Help people.
Oh.
Like I said, it's not the best thought of the study, but there's lots of studies. So we're intentionally manipulating mood level.
Yeah.
I would say it's minimal risk in the sense that people are going to experience sort of ups and downs of daily emotional states. But I mean, we're intentionally making them sad for 3 minutes or something. Is that verboten for my students?
Is that what for your students?
No, I'm being a smart ass and pretending I can speak German, which I don't. Is that all right? Could we do that? Maybe I should just ask John directly, but since you're here.
John, is there some issue I need to know about here?
I don't think so, but your advice was wise, and it's one we tell instructors: if you have a question, you ask the Research Ethics Board.
Yeah.
Right. Okay. And,
well, I am. That's what I looked there.
Yeah.
So that wouldn't go over at UBC time phrase?
In the context, do you want to answer? Nobody wants to answer your question. In the context, you know what, I think in a class project in psychology where students are are very knowledgeable. They're in psychology themselves. This would probably be, is this second year, third year of psychology? Yeah, so it's a research methods class. People are entrenched in the discipline. They understand the risks and benefits. They are adults. And you're not asking them to tap into personal events in their past. These are videos that are being shown, and I would say that as long as the videos are not over the top, and that's when you consult with John, I think that would probably be a reasonable, very minimal risk project. I get upset when I see sharing on commercials, and I don't think, just because I have that tear-jerk reaction, this is what having kids does to you, doesn't mean that it's a transient risk. It's something that they feel only temporarily, and I would try to avoid things that might trigger real experiences for people, but John would be someone, show him the video. Okay. But I don't think that would necessarily not qualify.
It occurs to me, my department's philosophy, that there are conceptual issues here, right? So what counts as an over-the-top video that students wouldn't see in their daily life? So if you define minimal risk in terms of the risks that are encountered by individuals in their daily life related to the research, gosh, what do students look at online, right? So in fact, part of the issue here is how do you define minimal risk, but my guess is that you can take a pretty generous interpretation of that, I think. Okay. Just because there's so much that people read about and watch that is upsetting, and that's just part of education and what's available in our culture.
Yep, that's thank you for both. So electric shock is now next.
We'll talk about that one. Kevin.
A question for Terry. You started off with an interesting example where you were dealing with individuals who had been recently released from prison. And you mentioned some of the results that came out in that research and how cautious one has to be about sharing results, especially sensitive results. You mentioned theft at Army and Navy and selling HIV-infected blood. Has that information come out in some way to either the community that was involved, or Army and Navy, or those organizations that would be impacted by selling HIV-infected blood? So I'd just be interested to see what you did with that information.
So the question was about the research project on the prisoner population and sharing some of the questionable or ethical results. So in the first instance about Army and Navy, the answer was no. That information was not shared directly with Army and Navy, but was shared with the greater research community. However, as a result of, well, I couldn't say as a result of, but after those results were shared, and I think probably concurrently, Army and Navy suddenly increased their security force in the in-store security, and put up a lot of electronic surveillance stuff.
So that was a result of
I couldn't say that
disseminating the research results.
No, I hope it wasn't. I hope that I didn't have anything to do with that. I would hope that Army and Navy probably understood that was going on long before it came up in the research project. But I didn't actively go out and seek to relay that information to people that were affected by it, because I felt it was probably my role was to protect what they had said. In the terms of, it was a bit more of a discussion in terms of the blood issue with HIV, and I ended up informing some public health officials and had a discussion with them, initially very anonymous, or I should take care here, but confidentially, I talked with public health and some of the health authority personnel around the issue of, well, what could happen if somebody, and they assured me that it wasn't possible for that to happen, that physically the the process in place when someone goes to give blood or takes in a care card. There were enough measures in place to circumvent people from abusing that. And that was their stance. I didn't believe it. And quite frankly, what they told me wasn't plausible to me as a community person. I could see several holes in what they were telling me was the reason why people couldn't do that. So I just left it at that. I thought, okay, so they are aware that there's an issue, that this could potentially go on. They were quite confident that, that wasn't going on. So it was kind of a win-win. And, in the sense of the community people, I didn't have to tell on anyone, and I didn't cut off their means of livelihood if they looked at it that way. But it was, the bigger problem there was the discussion around, okay, how do you bring this very sensitive topic up, and to whom, and how does it get addressed, for sure.
Thank you.
Ryan?
Do you think this, maybe for Terry, just an extension of that, do you think that there's an acknowledgement on the part of maybe law enforcement or government or other involved parties that that anonymity and confidentiality in sensitive situations like those is acceptable because down the road it will lead to a cessation of the dangerous behavior? So maybe, for example, with the Army and Navy situation, is it acceptable not to report those activities because the research might lead to a cessation of the shoplifting down the road? Do you think there's an acknowledgement of that, or is it strictly that if you participate in research, you should have no fear that you will ever be identified, and that your activities reported during the research will not be reported to the authorities? So
the question was, and I'm paraphrasing, tell me if it's not correct, but around research participants, should they know that the information could be passed on and maybe cut off their means of support for themselves in some way? So my response to that is a couple of things. So in that particular case, I chose to back up, and I looked at the larger issue was, why would people do that? Why were people shoplifting when they got out of prison? What is that about? And so with a little investigative work, actually not much, I was able to determine that really the problem was being released from prison with nothing, no resources, no money, no means of supporting yourself. So I attacked the problem from that end. I worked within the correction system to put in place a practical solution to prisoners being released, both from male and female prisons, around service provisions and monetary provisions, so that they could have a check, or they could have a voucher, or know a place to go. Active release planning is essentially what it ended up being. So sometimes you have to look at the issue from the origin of it, and sometimes you can look at what people are telling you in a research project as far as the data collection, and then you make a call on that. So I would hope that people would really look at the underlying issue and determine what their role and their responsibility in that role is in an ethical way as well. Because it's not clear cut. It's not something that you get a guidebook on, or you can look up on the internet. You really do have to wrestle with these things, and I would hope that as researchers we take that responsibility to look at what we're gathering here and what that information actually means to the people that we're gathering with. So it's each individual case, I think, needs to be really looked at carefully.
Can I just add to that? Just because we have a large criminology department at SFU that does research with people who do bad things. So for us, really, we talk about this a lot, and you don't have a duty to report illegal activity unless the illegal activity has to do with children, like harm of a child. It's the only one where you have to actually report. So really, when we're looking at studies as a research ethics board, we're looking at protecting that participant, regardless of whether that participant is doing horrible things, right? And so even if that person reveals to you that they're doing something bad, that you weren't thinking that was going to happen, and if you never told them in their consent form that you would actually report on these things, we wouldn't want you to, like as a research ethics board, because now you are violating the participants' rights. Like you told them that you weren't gonna keep their information confidential, and that you weren't gonna ever report that information, and then you go ahead and do it. That you totally ruin that relationship with that person. So and that has effects not just for your research, but for just research in general.
I think that's what Terry was saying,
Yeah.
as far as engaging. As far as I know, and this may just add to it, because I know there's been a lot of discussion around what is reportable, what isn't. There's really 3 things that are by law reportable, and somebody jump in if I'm wrong. It's communicable diseases, it's child abuse, and imminent harm, like the intent of murder, are the 3 that I think.
There's not a duty to report imminent harm, there's a permission to disclose.
Okay, see, I'm glad you're here.
If it's clear, unlike a duty to report communicable diseases under certain circumstances, or if you have a positive test result.
Yeah.
So we don't have in law in Canada a U.S. type of a situation where there's a duty to warn or a duty to disclose imminent harm yet. It might come to that. Permission to disclose it gives discretion and in fact protects. I like it in part because it protects the research and participant relationship in the way that Dina just described.
Yeah.
Can I ask a question? So it is around this issue of dissemination. Since so many surveys, and probably an increasing number of them, are going to be done online, where you don't have a direct interaction with the community that you are collecting information from, can you tell us a little bit about how you encourage or how you see dissemination of results happening in those sorts of circumstances? So you've all mentioned the importance of sort of contact and respect for the community that you're collecting data from. We're seeing more and more online surveys where there's no direct recruitment. What about dissemination of results in those circumstances? Just comments.
Do you mean like how those individuals who participated get to receive results?
Yeah, you've got an anonymous, you make it anonymous or as anonymous as you can, so you're not collecting email addresses or personal information. Yet I still think there is a sort of duty to disseminate information and to try to make it available to people who contributed their time and their knowledge.
So we've done 2 different things. So sometimes people will include a link to a place where they're going to post the results eventually. So if the person wanted to see the results at the end, they would write down the link. We've also done it where they click on, at the end of the survey, they click on something else, which will then, they can then put their email address in, which the researcher will have, so that they can then send the results to them as well. And then another way is to have just the researcher's information and say, you can contact us for results, and that will happen at the end of the survey as well.
Okay, good, thanks very much. Other questions? Okay.
I have a question. I'm not sure. It's maybe a better question for John, really, but I'm coming from the library, and so we do some surveys every now and then just around process improvement. And I'm under the impression that those don't have to go to the research ethics board. Is that typically correct?
Quality control?
Quality control, basically.
Program review.
Yeah, we would.
Yeah. And I'm wondering if that, at what point would something like that have to go to the REB if you know librarians, we like to share and just talk about things like that. We have like meetups and we talk about some things that came out of the surveys that we've
So you're allowed to disseminate quality assurance and performance evaluation and stuff. That doesn't, just because you're going to disseminate it doesn't mean you need research ethics review. It's more about the intent of the actual study. So if your intent was quality assurance or performance evaluation, we wouldn't need to see it. If your intent is, I have a research question now and I want to use the survey to answer, then we would see it.
I'll just add to that, if you then take that data and you want to use it for a research purpose, as Jean defined research, then that's secondary use of data, and that would require review by the Research Ethics Board. That's discussed in this draft governance and management procedures guidance that may have been approved by now, but is in the process of being approved at Langara. All right, thank you very much for coming today, and please join me in wishing our presenters